We have to be honest and acknowledge that a big part of the money in our banks comes precisely from the exploitation of the African continent. Without Africa, France will slide down into the rank of a third world power. Neo-colonialism is a system that is described as a new type of colonialism, literally, new colonialism. It is a practice of using capitalism, globalization, and cultural imperialism to influence a country instead of the previous methods of indirect political control or direct military control. No continent was as affected as adversely by this system than the continent of Africa. By the mid-20th century, Africa was dominated by the colonial systems of two nations, Britain and France. And although Britain has come and mostly left, France still plays an integral part on the continent. The French imposition in Africa had become so ubiquitous and so ingrained that there was a word for it, Françafrique, combining the words France and Africa to refer to France's dominion in the sub-Saharan region. True to neo-colonial doctrine, France's part in Africa isn't restricted to the intervention in the Sahel or naval might in Djibouti. The biggest contributing force that France has on the continent is not military, but monetary. When I posted my first video on France's global ambitions, I opened my phone to see what I wanted to write about next. What I found wasn't just a subject, but irony. It looked as if the CFA Franc would soon be history. Since the mid-20th century, France has sought to exert its influence in Africa through this monetary system, and now it seems like this system is on the way out, and will be replaced by a currency called ECO. There have been calls for reform or the abandonment of the CFA since its inception, as many scholars and statesmen have called it exploitative. In this video, I will talk about the validity of those claims, as well as the CFA's history and the proposal for the new ECO currency. The CFA is a controversial currency system that is used throughout sub-Saharan Africa. The currency was established by the de Gaulle government in 1945 in response to the new Bretton Woods system, in order to stabilize African countries and stimulate imports from France. CFA stands for Colonies Francoises d'Afrique, or in English, French colonies in Africa. Today there are different names for the West African and Central African francs. The West African franc being African Financial Community, and Central African being Financial Cooperation in Africa. In this system, there are two currencies, one for the West African countries of Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo, and one for the Central African countries of Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, the Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. Although the West and Central African francs are issued by two different banks, they effectively act the same and are beholden to the four main tenets of the CFA franc system. The four main tenets are: 1. The CFA would be fixed to the French franc. This would eventually be replaced by the euro, and 1 euro is now equal to about 656 CFA francs. 2. There are free capital transfers within the franc zone. 3. There is an unlimited convertibility of CFA francs to euros. And 4. To guarantee convertibility, participants in the system are required to deposit 50% of the foreign exchange reserves in a special French treasury operating account. And in order to access those funds, CFA countries would have to borrow it from the French treasury at fixed exchange rates. With this last point, you can kind of see why Chirac was saying that France exploited Africa. This is akin to giving your boss half the money you earn and being thankful that you can borrow it someday with interest. France seems to have so much power over the CFA franc zone that even the CFA notes themselves are printed in France before they are exported and put into circulation in Africa. This makes the currency system seem like an unnecessarily austere program. But is there any way that the CFA can benefit those who participate? Before we can understand what the currency does for Africa, it is important to understand what the CFA does for France. France benefits from the CFA franc in three major ways. First, it funnels money into metropolitan France and allows France to extend credit to CFA countries with those countries' own money. Second, this system of control has allowed France to obtain entitlement to African contracts and resources. The stable and expensive franc allows French firms to easily do business within the zone, readily convert their revenue into euros, and send it back to Europe. This is good for Europeans and the African elite and populace, as it provides business opportunities and jobs that otherwise wouldn't be there. Third, it has allowed France to remain relevant on the continent long after its colonial rival, Great Britain, was forced out. During the Cold War era, France had remained the third most influential outside force on the continent besides the United States and USSR. Now, France still remains the third most influential outsider on the continent besides the US and China. During the tenure of the CFA system, the Republic of France has used ex-legionnaires to exert security interest and topple any threats against the franc. Politicians like international businessman and first president of Togo, Sylvanus Olympio, was overthrown with the help of France. And the Republic of Guinea was economically destabilized because trade unionist and first president Ahmed Sékou Touré had led his country to abandon the CFA. However, in most cases, France didn't have to retaliate. A crucial part of neo-colonialism is benefiting the political elite whose nation you control. Just as Imperial China gave benefits to the kings who chose to kowtow, so too does France. Security is obviously a big concern, and as I said, France isn't shy on using force to uphold the CFA. Rulers and elites in CFA franc countries who side with the currency can expect protection from France, including brutal dictators. There is also the benefit of an overvalued exchange rate, which means that the African elites can import French luxury goods at cheaper prices. An expensive franc means that goods from the Eurozone will be relatively cheap in CFA countries. Besides being overvalued, the CFA franc is pegged to the stability-obsessed euro, which means that the franc and franc zone will also experience stable prices throughout the system, as its value is set at a fixed rate by its bank and not by supply and demand. However, with the peg, the franc zone countries have given up the right to their own monetary policy and therefore the ability to control their own currency. In essence, CFA countries are forced to have a stable currency, but a stable currency might not be what CFA countries need. A steady currency like the euro, which aims at an annual 2% or below inflation rate, isn't great for economic growth. West and Central African countries are currently experiencing the largest population boom in the world and have suffered from underdevelopment. In order for Africans to be housed, educated, and fed, there needs to be growth within the economy. Interest rates must be low to stimulate borrowing, and inflation should be high, which will drive up wages and stimulate exports. Exporting is especially vital to the enrichment of sub-Saharan African countries, as most of their economies are based on raw material exports down the value chain, and a strong currency is a big barrier to exports. To make this simpler, let's compare CFA franc countries to other African non-franc countries. Ghana and Nigeria are both nations that are in West Africa and are nations that both use their own money. Part of having their own currencies and monetary policies is that they can devalue their currencies at will, and they have. Both Ghana and Nigeria are consequentially two of the richest countries in West Africa, while the other countries are held back because of stability. Ghana and Nigeria export more because the cedi and naira are so cheap. West and Central Africans might be better off with a monetary policy that is based on growth rather than stability. However, disregarding Ghana and Nigeria, other West African countries that do not use the CFA seem to be doing on par with the franc countries. This didn't stop Italian Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the Eurosceptic Five-Star Movement, Luigi Di Maio, from criticizing the CFA franc for underdevelopment and blaming France for the European migrant crisis. Di Maio has said France has kept the franc strong in order to induce French exports while simultaneously keeping Africans poor, forcing them to travel north to find jobs and robbing them of their own money to pay off French debt. Now, the claim that France uses African money to pay off French debt hasn't been proven and might be more vitriol than verity. But Di Maio does make a point.
L'histoire est en marche, nul ne l'arrêtera. On n'en veut plus, on n'en peut plus.
2008, musicians from France, Ivory Coast, Mali, and other countries across West Africa released a song called 7 Minutes Contre le CFA, or 7 Minutes Against the CFA Franc. Elom Vince, a Togolese rapper, said, "We decided to write the song against the CFA Franc because we want the general public to know about the issue. The CFA Franc will die, and we will dance at its funeral." This song helped to popularize a message that some African intellectuals and statesmen have been trying to spread for decades, and it might have worked. In December of 2019, during his travels to the Ivory Coast, President Emmanuel Macron of France, along with Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara, announced the end of the West African CFA franc system and the launch of a new currency, ECO. It was short for ECOWAS, or the Economic Community of West African States. This ECO currency will not be restricted to the West African CFA region, but it is expected to expand beyond the rest of the ECOWAS community, apart from maybe Nigeria. The ECO currency reforms will provide some pivotal changes. Mainly, France will withdraw from the committees and board of the West African Central Bank, and West African countries will no longer have to keep 50% of their reserves with the Bank of France, but instead can invest it wherever they see fit. These are some incredible differences from the ECO and will lessen the French neo-colonial influence in the region. But is this change enough? Is this new currency just a rebranding, or will the change from CFA Franc to ECO produce a concrete renaissance within the lives of Africans? Unfortunately, many economists and political activists are not too convinced. First, even rolling out the ECO is going to provide a difficult task. The ECO is expected to meet its debut in mid-2020, but none of the countries can feasibly meet the criteria except for maybe Ghana and the Ivory Coast. Inability to meet the criteria has postponed a single currency in West Africa multiple times since 2003. Another main problem that the ECO has is the currency is still pegged to the stable euro. French firms will still operate in the same way that they have been for decades, which might not be bad, but it will not help generate small African businesses or empower a freehold or entrepreneurial class. Interest rates will remain high and loans will remain small. Small African businesses will not be more likely to start up. Small loans and high interest rates will be taken advantage of by regional competitors like Nigeria. Like China, Nigeria has been labeled a currency manipulator, and it will devalue its currency to gain a strategic exporting advantage. If Nigeria is not invited to the ECO, like France allegedly wants, then they can flood the market with their raw materials, particularly petroleum, at a much lower cost than the rest of the ECOWAS region otherwise can. If Nigeria is invited to the ECO, then France's role of the dominating power in the CFA will be substituted with the position Nigeria will have for the ECO. Nigeria alone will have an economic stranglehold on West Africa, as it will make up 50% of the region's population and 2/3 of the GDP. Nigeria will be like to the ECOWAS region as Germany is to the European Union, but on steroids. Completely and utterly dominating the area. Fans of the Euro crisis saga will also see other similarities between the ECO and the Euro, mainly that they will suffer from the same fundamental flaw. Individual nations with different fiscal policies, aka taxing and spending, cannot have the same currency. European economies are already incredibly diverse, speak multiple different languages, and contain religious and ethnic tensions. Europeans do not see themselves as the same, and therefore are not willing to compromise prosperity in one region to lift another, as Americans and Indians are willing to do. West Africans will feel the same way as Europeans, but these problems that they are subjected to are magnified in West Africa. No matter how different Germany's and Italy's economies seem, their differences are minuscule compared to the economic divergences of Ghana and the Gambia. Ethnic tensions within the EU are nothing compared to one of the worst places in the world for violence and tribal hatred. If a common currency is introduced, then it will only exacerbate the differences in West Africa politically and economically. It'll be foolish to think that a simple monetary change can be a panacea for African economic problems, especially one that doesn't provide much real transformation. Corruption, lack of infrastructure, and access to clean water are still some of the most vital problems in the region that need fixing, and the ECO obviously addresses none of these. The new currency will also not change much in the geopolitical realm either. French corporations such as Orange will continue to take advantage of the exchange rate and operate and expand in the region, while also continuing to send capital, intelligent Africans back to Paris. But that is a topic for another video. This has been the 10,000. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe in order to support the channel.